It is this. Sometimes she had taken comfort in the thought that she and Tommy lived in the country, where crime was not a concern, because if they had still lived in the city, she would have had even more to worry about. But now bucolic Cascade Farm, at the hayseed end of Black Oak Road, had proved to be as dangerous as any crime-riddled metropolis. "Put on your coat," she told Tommy. Doofus's ears pricked. He sniffed the air. He turned his head side to side, surveying the base of the cupboards, the refrigerator, the unlit open cabinet under the sink. Holding the Mossberg in her right hand, Meg speared her own coat off the rack with her left, struggled until she got her arm into it, took the shotgun in her left hand, shrugged her right arm into the second sleeve. She used just one hand to pull on her boots, refusing to put down the weapon. Tommy was staring at the rat trap that she had left on the counter, the one that she had taken from under the sink. The stick that the rats had used to trip the mechanism was still wedged between the anvil and the hammer bar. Tommy frowned at it. Before he could ask questions or have more time to think, Meg said, "You can do without a boot on your good foot, and leave your crutches here. They're no good outside. You'll have to lean on me." Doofus twitched and went rigid. Meg brought up the gun and scanned the kitchen. The Labrador growled deep in his throat, but there was no sign of the rats. Meg pulled open the back door, letting in the frigid wind. "Let's move, let's go, now." Tommy lurched outside, holding onto the door frame, then balancing against the porch wall. The dog slipped out after him. Meg followed, closing the door behind them. Holding the Mossberg in her right hand, using her left arm to support Tommy, she helped the boy across the porch, down the snow-covered steps, and into the yard. With the wind chill factor, the temperature must have been below 0. Her eyes teared, and her face went numb. She hadn't paused to put on gloves, and the cold sliced through to the bones of her hands. Still, she felt better outside than in the house, safer. She didn't think that the rats would come after them, for the storm was a far greater obstacle to those small creatures than it was to her and Tommy. Conversation was impossible because the wind keened across the open land, whistled under the eaves of the house, and clattered the bare branches of the maples against one another. She and Tommy progressed silently, and Doofus stayed at their side. Though they slipped several times and almost fell, they reached the barn quicker than she had expected, and she hit the switch to put up the electric door. They ducked under the rising barrier before it was entirely out of their way. In the weak light of the lone bulb, they went directly to the station wagon. She fished her keys out of her coat pocket, opened the door on the passenger side, slid the seat back all the way on its tracks, and helped Tommy into the front of the car because she wanted him beside her now, close, not in the back seat, even if he would have been more comfortable there. When she looked around for the dog, she saw that he was standing outside the barn, at the threshold, unwilling to follow them inside. "Doofus, here! Quick now!" she said. The Labrador whined. Surveying the shadows in the barn, he let the whine deepen into a growl. Remembering the feeling of being watched when she had parked the Jeep in the barn earlier, Meg also scanned the murky corners and the tenebrous reaches of the loft, but she saw neither pale, slinking figures nor the telltale red glimmer of rodent eyes. The Labrador was probably excessively cautious. His condition was understandable, but they had to get moving. More forcefully, Meg said, "Doofus, get in here, right now." He entered the barn hesitantly, sniffing the air and floor, came to her with a sudden urgency, and jumped into the back seat of the station wagon. She closed the door, went around to the other side, and got in behind the wheel. "We'll drive back to Bilomek," she said. "We'll tell them we found what they're looking for." "What's wrong with Doofus?" In the back seat, the dog was moving from one side window to the other, peering out at the barn, making thin, anxious sounds. "He's just being Doofus," Meg said. Huddled in his seat, angled awkwardly to accommodate his cast, Tommy appeared to be younger than 10, so frightened and vulnerable. "It's okay," Meg said. "We're out of here." She thrust the key in the ignition, turned it. Nothing. She tried again. The Jeep would not start.
7. At the high fence along the northeast flank of the Biolamech property, Ben Parnell crouched to examine the rat-sized tunnel in the half-frozen earth. Several of his men gathered around him, and one directed the beam of a powerful flashlight on the patch of ground in question. Luckily, the hole was in a place where the wind scoured most of the snow away instead of piling it in drifts, but the searchers had not spotted it until they'd made a second circuit of the perimeter. Steve Harding raised his voice to compete with the wind.
"Think they're in there? Curled up in a burrow?"
"No," Ben said, his breath smoking in the Arctic air. If he'd thought that the rats were in a burrow at the end of this entrance tunnel, he would not have been crouched in front of the hole, where one of them might fly out at him, straight at his face. Hostile, John Acuff had said. Exceedingly hostile. Ben said, "No, they weren't digging a permanent burrow. They came up somewhere on the other side of this fence, and they're long gone now." A tall, lanky young man in a county sheriff's department coat joined the group.
"One of you named Parnell?"
"That's me," Ben said.
"I'm Joe Hockner."
He was half shouting to be heard above the skirling wind.
"Sheriff's office. I brought the bloodhound you asked for."
"Terrific."
"What's happening here?"
"In a minute," Ben said, returning his attention to the tunnel that went under the fence.
"How do we know it was them that dug here?"
asked George Yancey, another of Ben's men.
"Could have been some other animal."
"Bring that light closer," Ben said. Steve Harding shone the beam directly into the 5-inch diameter tunnel. Squinting, leaning closer, Ben saw what appeared to be snippets of white thread adhering to the moist earth just far enough inside the hole to be undisturbed by the wind. He took off his right glove, reached carefully into the mouth of the tunnel, and plucked up 2 of the threads. White hairs.
8. Tommy and the dog stayed in the station wagon while Meg got out with a shotgun and with a flashlight from the glove compartment to open the hood. The light revealed a mess of torn and tangled wires inside the engine compartment. All the lines from the spark plugs to the distributor cap were severed. Holes had been gnawed in the hoses. Oil and coolants dripped onto the barn floor under the Jeep. She was no longer just scared. She was flat out terrified. Yet she had to conceal her fear to avoid panicking Tommy. She closed the hood, went around to the passenger side, and opened the door. "I don't know what's wrong, but it's dead." "It was all right a while ago when we came home." "Yes, well, but it's dead now. Come on, let's go." He allowed her to help him out of the car, and when they were face to face, he said, "The rats got to it, didn't they?" "Rats? The rats are in the house, yes, and they're ugly things, like I said, but—" Interrupting her before she could lie to him, the boy said, "You're trying not to show it, but you're afraid of them, really afraid. Which must mean they're not just a little different from ordinary rats, but a whole lot different. Because you don't scare easy, not you. You were scared when Dad died, I know you were, but not for long. You took charge real quick. You made me feel safe. And if Dad's dying couldn't make you fall to pieces, then I guess pretty much nothing can. But these rats from Biolamech, whatever they are, they scare you more than anything ever has." She hugged him tight, loving him so hard that it almost hurt, though she did not let go of the shotgun. He said, "Mom, I saw the trap with a stick in it, and I saw the cereal in the sink all mixed up with the poison pellets, and I've been thinking. I guess one thing about these rats is they're awful smart, maybe because of something that was done to them at the lab, smarter than rats should ever be. And now they somehow zapped the Jeep. They're not smart enough. Not smart enough for us, Skipper." "What are we going to do?" he whispered. She also whispered, though she had seen no rats in the barn, and was not sure that they had remained after disabling the station wagon. Even if they were nearby, watching, she was certain that they could not understand English. Surely there were limits to what the people at Biolomech had done to these creatures, but she whispered anyway, "We'll go back to the house. But maybe that's what they want us to do. Maybe, but I've got to try to use the telephone." "They'll have thought of the phone," he said. "Maybe, but probably not. I mean, how smart can they be?" "Smart enough to think of the Jeep."
9. Beyond the fence was a meadow approximately 100 yards across, and at the end of the meadow were woods. The chance of finding the rats now was slim. The men fanned out across the field in teams of 2 and 3, not sure what signs of their quarry could have survived the storm. Even in good weather, on a dry and sunny day, it would be virtually impossible to track animals as small as rats across open ground. Ben Parnell took 4 men directly to the far side of the meadow, where they began searching the perimeter of the forest with the aid of the bloodhound. The dog's name was Max. He was built low and broad, with huge ears and a comical face, but there was nothing funny about his approach to the case at hand. He was eager, serious. Max's handler, Deputy Joe Hockner, had given the dog a whiff of the rat's spore from a jar full of grass and droppings that had been taken from their cage, and the hound hadn't liked what he smelled. But the scent was apparently so intense and unusual that it was easy to follow, and Max was a game tracker, willing to give his best in spite of wind and snow. Within 2 minutes, the hound caught the scent in a clump of winter-dried brush. Straining at his leash, he pulled Hockner into the woods. Ben and his men followed.
10. Meg let Doofus out of the station wagon, and the 3 of them headed toward the big open door of the barn, past which the storm wind drove whirling columns of snow like ghosts late for a haunting. The blizzard had accelerated, raising a noisy clatter on the roof as it tore off a few shingles and spun them away in the night. The rafters creaked, and the loft door chattered on loose hinges. "Tommy, you'll stay out on the porch, and I'll go into the kitchen as far as the phone. If it's out of order, we'll walk the driveway to the county road and flag down a car." "No one's going to be out in this storm." "Someone will be. A county snowplow or a cinder truck." He halted at the threshold of the open barn door. "Mom, it's 3/4 of a mile to Black Oak Road. I'm not sure I can walk that far with this cast, in this storm, not even with you helping. I'm already tired, and my good leg keeps buckling. Even if I can do it, it'll take a long, long time." "We'll make it," she said, "and it doesn't matter how long we take. I'm sure they won't pursue us outside. We're safe in the storm. Safe from them, at least." Then she remembered the sled. "I can pull you to the county road." "What? Pull me?" She risked leaving Tommy with Doofus long enough to run back into the barn, to the north wall, where the boy's sled, "Midnight Flyer" was the legend in script across the seat, hung on the wall beside a shovel, a hoe, and a leaf rake. Without putting down the Mossberg, she quickly unhooked the sled and carried it in one hand to the open door where Tommy waited. "But, Mom, I'm too heavy to pull." "Haven't I pulled you back and forth over this farm on at least 100 snowy days?" "Yeah, but that was years ago, when I was little." "You're not so huge now, buckaroo. Come on." She was pleased that she had remembered the sled. She had one great advantage over this high-tech Hamlin plague. She was a mother with a child to protect, and that made her a force with which even Biolomech's nightmares would find it hard to reckon. She took the sled outside and helped him onto it. He sat with his shoe-clad left foot braced against the guide bar. His right foot was covered with the cast, except for his toes, and both his toes and the lower part of the cast were sheathed in a thick woolen sock that was now wet and half-frozen. Nevertheless, he managed to wedge even that foot into the space in front of the guide bar. When he held on to the sides of the sled with both hands, he was in no danger of falling off. Doofus circled them anxiously as they got Tommy settled on the sled. Several times he barked at the barn behind them, but each time that Meg looked back, she saw nothing. Picking up the sturdy nylon tow rope, Meg prayed that when they got to the house the phone would work, that she would be able to call for help. She dragged Tommy across the long backyard. In some places the runners cut through the thin layer of snow, digging into frozen ground beneath, and the going was tough. In other places, however, where the snow was deeper or the ground icy, the sled glided smoothly enough to give her hope that, if they had to, they would be able to reach the county road before the relentless gales hammered her to her knees in exhaustion.
11. The brush on the forest floor was not too dense, and the rats evidently took advantage of deer trails to make greater speed, for the bloodhound plunged relentlessly forward, leading the searchers where the creatures had gone. Fortunately, the interlaced evergreens kept most of the snow from sifting under the trees, which made their job easier and was a boon to the stumpy-legged dog. Ben expected Max to bay, for he had seen all the old jailbreak movies in which Cagney or Bogart had been pursued by baying hounds, but Max made a lot of chuffing and snuffling sounds, barked once, and did not bay at all. They had gone a quarter of a mile from the Biolamech fence, stumbling on the uneven ground, frequently spooked by the bizarre shadows stirred by the bobbling beams of the flashlights, when Ben realized that the rats had not burrowed into the forest floor. If that had been their intention, they could have tunneled into the ground shortly after entering the cover of the trees. But they had raced on, searching for something better than a wild home, which made sense because they were not wild, far from it. They had been bred from generations of tame lab rats, and lived all their lives in a cage, with food and water constantly available. They would be at a loss in the woods, even as smart as they were, so they would try to press ahead in hope of finding a human habitation to share, travel as far as possible before exhaustion and the deepening cold stopped them. Cascade Farm. Ben remembered the attractive woman in the jeep wagon, chestnut hair, almond brown eyes, an appealing spatter of freckles. The boy in the back seat, his leg in a cast, had been 9 or 10 and had reminded Ben of his own daughter, Melissa, who had been 9 when she had lost her hard-fought war with cancer. The boy had that look of innocence and vulnerability that Melissa had possessed and that had made it so hard for Ben to watch her decline. Peering at mother and son through the open car window, Ben had envied them the normal life he imagined they'd led, the love and sharing of a family unscathed by the whims of fate. Now, crashing through the woods behind Deputy Hockner and the dog, Ben was seized by the horrible certainty that the rats, having escaped from Biolamech hours before the snow began to fall, had made it to Cascade Farm, the nearest human habitat, and that the family he had envied was in mortal danger. Lassiter. That was their name. With a surety almost psychic in intensity, Ben knew that the rats had taken up residence with the Lassiters. Hostile, Acuff had said. Exceedingly hostile. Mindlessly, unrelentingly, demonically hostile.
"Hold up! Wait! Hold up!"
he shouted. Deputy Hockner reined in Max, and the search party came to a halt in a clearing encircled by wind-shaken pines. Explosive clouds of crystallized breath plumed from the nostrils and mouths of the men, and they all turned to look questioningly at Ben. He said, "Steve, go back to the main gate. Load up a truck with men and get down to Cascade Farm. You know it?"
"Yeah, it's the next place along Black Oak Road."
"God help those people, but I'm sure the rats have gone there. It's the only warm place near enough. If they didn't stumble on Cascade Farm and take refuge there, then they'll die in this storm, and I don't think we're lucky enough to count on the weather having done them in."
"I'm on my way,"
Steve said, turning back. To Deputy Hockner, Ben said, "All right, let's go, and let's hope to God I'm wrong." Hockner relaxed the tension on Max's leash. This time the hound bayed once, long and low, when he caught the rat's scent.
12. By the time Meg drew the sled across the long yard to the foot of the porch steps, her heart was thudding almost painfully, and her throat was raw from the frigid air. She was far less sanguine than she first had been about her ability to haul Tommy all the way out to the county road. The task might have been relatively easy after the storm had passed. However, now she was not just fighting the boy's weight, but the vicious wind as well. Furthermore, the sled's runners had not been sanded, oil-polished, and soaped in preparation for the season, so the rust on them created friction. Doofus stayed close to the sled, but he was beginning to suffer from the effects of the blizzard. He shuddered uncontrollably. His coat was matted with snow. In the vague amber light that radiated from the kitchen windows to the yard at the bottom of the porch steps, Meg could see tiny glistening icicles hanging from the ruff on the Labrador's throat. Tommy was in better shape than the dog. He had pulled up the hood on his coat and had bent forward, keeping his face out of the punishing wind. But neither he nor Meg wore insulated underwear, and they were both dressed in jeans rather than heavy outdoor pants. On the longer trek from the house to Black Oak Road, the wind would leach a lot of heat from them. Again she prayed that the telephone would work. Looking up at her, Tommy was bleak-faced within the cowl of his coat. All but shouting against the cacophonous babble of the storm, she told him to wait there, as if he could do anything else, told him that she would be back in a minute, although they both knew that something terrible could happen to her in the house. Carrying the 12-gauge Mossberg, she went up the porch steps and cautiously opened the back door. The kitchen was a mess. Packages of food had been dragged out of the cabinets, torn open, and the contents scattered across the floor. Several kinds of cereal, sugar, flour, cornstarch, cornmeal crackers, cookies, macaroni, and spaghetti were mixed with the shattered glass and wet contents of a score of broken jars of spaghetti sauce, applesauce, cherries, olives, and pickles. The destruction was unnerving because it was so unmistakably an expression of mindless rage. The rats had not torn these packages to obtain food. The creatures seemed so inimical to humankind that they destroyed people's property for the joy of it, reveling in the ruin and waste in much the way that gremlins of age-old myth were supposed to delight in the trouble that they caused. These monsters, of course, were man-made. What kind of world had it become when men created their own goblins? Or had that always been the case? She could see no signs of the rats that had caused the ruin in the kitchen, no furtive movement in the shadowy cupboards, no sinuous forms slinking along the walls or through the rubble. Cautiously, she stepped across the threshold into the house. The icy wind came with her, exploding through the door, as if it were water under high pressure. White clouds of flour and sparkling miniature tornadoes of sugar granules were spun across the room, and some of the heavier debris, Cheerios and broken bits of spaghetti, took flight as well. Garbage and shattered glass crunched underfoot as she edged warily to the telephone, which hung on the wall on the far side of the room, near the refrigerator. 3 times she saw movement from the corner of her eye, and was sure it was purposeful. The rats, and she swung the muzzle of the shotgun to bear on it. But it was always just an empty raisin box, or the torn wrapper from a package of cookies stirring in the invasive wind. She reached the phone and lifted the handset. No dial tone. The line was dead, either because of the storm or the rats. As Meg regretfully returned the handset to its cradle, the wind subsided. In the suddenly still air, she smelled fumes. Natural gas. No, not natural gas, something else, more like gasoline. Heating oil. All her internal alarm bells began to clang. Now that cold wind was no longer sweeping through the room, Meg realized that the house reeked of heating oil fumes, which must be rising from the basement where the lines between the big oil tank and the furnace had been breached. She had walked into a trap. These rat-like gremlins were so hostile, so demonic, that they were willing to destroy the house that provided them with shelter if, in leveling it, they could kill one human being. She stepped away from the telephone toward the door. Through the ventilation duct, she heard the soft, hollow, echoey, familiar thump-click whoosh of the electronic pilot light on the basement furnace, the sparking of an electric arc to ignite the heating coils, A fraction of a second later, before she could even take a second step, the house exploded.
13. Following the bloodhound and Deputy Hockner, followed in turn by 3 of his own men, Ben Parnell reached the northern perimeter of the woods and saw the faint lights of the house at Cascade Farm, dimly visible through the heavily falling snow, perhaps 200 yards away across a sloping field. "I knew it," he said. "That's where they've gone." He thought of the woman and the boy in the station wagon, and he was overcome by a powerful sense of responsibility for them that went beyond his duties at Biolamec. For 2 years, he'd felt that he had failed his own child, Melissa, by not saving her from cancer, which was irrational, of course, because he was not a doctor and did not have the knowledge to cure her. But his profound feeling of failure couldn't be assuaged. He'd always had an unusually strong sense of responsibility to and for others, a virtue that sometimes could be a curse. Now, as he looked down on Cascade Farm, he was gripped by a powerful and urgent need to ensure the safety of that woman, her boy, and whatever other members of their family shared the farmhouse. "Let's move," he said to his men. Deputy Hockner was unfolding a lightweight blanket made from one of those space-age materials with high insulation. "You go ahead," he said, dropping to his knees and wrapping Max in the blanket. "My dog has to warm up. He isn't built for prolonged exposure to this kind of weather. Soon as he's thawed out a bit, we'll follow you." Ben nodded, turned, and took only 2 steps when, out on the lowlands, the farmhouse exploded. A yellow-orange flash of light was followed by a shockwave, a low and ominous wham that was felt as much as heard. Flames leaped from the shattered windows and raced up the walls.
14. The floor bucked, throwing Meg off her feet. Then it fell into place, and she fell with it, face down in the torn packages, scattered food, and glass. The breath was knocked out of her, and she was temporarily deafened by the blast. But she was not so disoriented that she was unaware of the fire, which licked up the walls and spread across the floor with frightening speed, as though it were alive and intent upon cutting her off from the door. As she pushed onto her knees, she saw that blood slicked her hand. She had been cut by the broken glass. It wasn't life-threatening, just a gash across a meaty part of her left palm, but deep enough to hurt. She felt no pain, probably because she was in a state of shock. Still holding the shotgun tightly in her right hand, she rose to her feet. Her legs were shaky, but she stumbled toward the door as fire seethed over all 4 walls, across the ceiling. She made it through the door just as the kitchen floor began to crack apart behind her. The porch was badly damaged by the blast, and the roof sagged toward the middle. When she moved off the bottom step into the yard, one of the corner posts snapped from the strain of dislocation. The porch collapsed in her wake, as if her passage had been sufficient to disturb its delicate balance, and her temporary deafness ended with that crash. Tommy had been thrown off the sled by the shock wave of the explosion, and he had either rolled or crawled about 20 feet farther from the burning house. He was sprawled in the snow, and the Labrador was attending him solicitously. Meg raced to him, certain that he had been hurt, though nothing had fallen on him, and though he was beyond the reach of the fire. He was all right, frightened, crying, but all right. She said, "It's okay. Everything's going to be fine, baby." But she doubted that he could hear her reassurances above the howling of the wind and the roar of the flames that consumed the house. Hugging him, feeling him alive against her, Meg was relieved and grateful, and furious with the rats and with the men who had made those gremlins. She had once thought that her career as an artist was the most important thing in her life. Then, for a while, when she and Jim were first married and struggling to build the ad agency into a thriving business, financial success seemed ever so important. But long ago, she had realized that the most important thing in life was family, the caring relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children. In this world beneath heaven and above hell, It seemed that irresistible forces were bent on the destruction of the family. Disease and death tore loved ones apart. War, bigotry, and poverty dissolved families in the corrosive acids of violence, hatred, want. And sometimes, families brought themselves to ruin through base emotions, envy, jealousy, lust. She had lost Jim, half her family, but she had held on to Tommy and to the house that had harbored the memory of Jim. Now the house had been taken from her by those rat-4 man-made gremlins, but she was not going to let them take Tommy, and she was determined to make them pay dearly for what they had already stolen. She helped Tommy move farther away from the house, into the open where the full force of the wind and cold would probably protect him from the rats. Then she set out alone for the barn at the back of the yard. The rats would be there. She was certain that they had not immolated themselves. They'd left the house after tampering with the furnace and setting the trap for her. She knew that they would not huddle in the open, which left only the barn. She figured that they had constructed a tunnel between the two structures. They must have arrived in mid-afternoon, which gave them time to scout the property and to dig the long, connecting subterranean passage. They were big, stronger than ordinary rats, so the tunnel would not have been a major project. While she and Tommy had struggled from house to barn to house again, the rats had scampered easily back and forth through the ground beneath them. Meg went to the barn, not just to blast away at the rats out of a need for vengeance. More important, it was the only place where she and Tommy had a hope of surviving the night. With the cut in her left hand, she was limited to one arm with which to pull the sled. She was also in mild shock, and shock was draining. Previously, she had realized that pulling the sled out to Black Oak Road in 60-mile-per-hour winds and sub-zero cold, then waiting hours until a road crew came by, was a task at the extremity of her endurance. In her current condition, she would not make it, and neither would Tommy. The house was gone, which left only the barn as a shelter, so she would have to take it back from the rats, kill all of them and reclaim her property, if she and her son were to live. She had no hope that anyone would see the glow of the fire from afar and come inquiring as to the cause. Cascade Farm was relatively isolated, and the cloaking effect of the blizzard would prevent the flames from being seen at much of a distance. At the open barn door, she hesitated. The lone bulb still burned inside, but the shadows seemed deeper than before. Then, with the wind and the orange light of her burning home at her back, she entered the gremlin's lair.
15. Ben Parnell discovered that the sloping meadow was cut by a series of natural angled drainage channels that made progress difficult. In the nearly blinding tempest of snow, the ground was dangerous, for he often realized that a ditch lay ahead only when he fell into it. Rapid progress across the field was sure to result in a sprained ankle or broken leg, so he and his men maintained a cautious pace, although the sight of the burning house terrified him. He knew that the rats had caused the fire. He did not know how or why they had done it, but the timely eruption of the flames could not be a coincidence. Through his mind passed disturbing images of the woman and the boy, their rat-gnawed bodies aflame in the middle of the house.
16. She was scared. It was an odd fear that did not weaken her, but contributed to her strength and determination. A cornered rat would freeze up in panic, but a cornered woman was not always easy prey. It depended on the woman. Meg walked to the middle of the barn, in front of the jeep. She looked around at the shadowy stalls along the south wall, at the open loft suspended from the front wall, and at the large, empty, and long unused feed bin in the northeast corner. She sensed that the rats were present and watching her. They were not going to reveal themselves while she was armed with the shotgun, yet she had to lure them into the open to shoot them. They were too smart to be enticed with food. So, if she could not lure them, perhaps she could force them into the open with a few well-placed rounds from the 12-gauge. She walked slowly down the center of the barn, to the end farthest from the door. As she passed the stalls that had once housed livestock, she peered intently into the shadows, seeking the telltale gleam of small red eyes. At least 1 or 2 gremlins must be crouched in those pools of darkness. Although she saw none of the enemy, she began to fire into the stalls as she moved again toward the front of the barn. Blam, blam, blam. 3 rounds in 3 of those narrow spaces. A yard-long flare spurting from the muzzle with each hard explosion, the thunderous gunfire echoing off the barn walls. When she fired the 3rd shot, a squealing pair of rats burst from the 4th stall into the better-lighted center of the barn, sprinting toward the cover offered by the disabled jeep. She pumped 2 rounds into them, and both were hit, killed, tossed end over end as if they were rags in a typhoon. She had emptied the Mossberg. Wincing, she dug in her pockets with her injured hand and extracted the 4 shells, reloading fast. As she jammed the last of the rounds into the magazine, she heard several high shrieks behind her. She turned. 6 large white rats with misshapen skulls were charging her. 4 of the creatures realized that they were not going to reach her fast enough. They peeled off from the pack and disappeared under the car. Unnerved by the swiftness with which the last 2 closed the gap, she fired twice, decisively eliminating them. She hurried around the jeep in time to see the other 4 scurry out from under the vehicle and across the floor toward the old feed bin. She fired once, twice, as they vanished into the shadows at the base of that big storage box. She was out of ammunition. She pumped the Mossberg anyway, as if by that act she could make another shell appear magically in the chamber, but the clackety-clack of the gun's action had a distinctly different sound when the magazine was empty. Either because they knew what that sound meant as well as she did, or because they knew that she had been left with only 9 rounds, the 5 in the shotgun and the 4 they had not managed to steal from the carton in her bedroom closet. The rats that had vanished under the bin now reappeared. 4 pale forms sunk into the wan light from the single dusty bulb overhead. Meg reversed her hold on the shotgun, gripping it by the barrel, making a club of it. Trying to ignore the pain in her left palm, she raised the gun over her head. The rats continued to approach slowly, then more boldly. She glanced behind, half expecting to see a dozen other rats encircling her, but evidently there were no more. Just these 4. They might as well have numbered 1,000, however, for she knew that she wouldn't be able to club more than one of them before they reached her and crawled up her legs. When they were on her, biting and clawing at her throat and face, she would not be able to deal with even 3 of them, not with her bare hands. She glanced at the big open door, but she knew that if she threw the gun down and ran for the safety of the mean winter night, she would not make it before the rats were on her. As if sensing her terrible vulnerability, the 4 creatures began to make a queer, keening sound of triumph. They lifted their grotesque, malformed heads and sniffed at the air, lashed their thick tails across the floor, and in unison let out a short shriek more shrill than any that Meg had heard from them before. Then they streaked toward her. Although she knew that she could never make the door in time, she had to try. If the rats killed her, Tommy would be helpless out there in the snow with his broken leg. He would freeze to death by morning. If the rats didn't risk the fury of the storm to go after him. She turned from the advancing pack, dashed toward the exit, and was startled to see a man silhouetted in the fading but still bright glow of the burning house. He was holding a revolver, and he said, "Get out of the way!" Meg flung herself to one side, and the stranger squeezed off 4 quick shots. He hit only 1 of the rats, because they made small targets for a handgun. The remaining 3 vanished again into the shadows at the base of the feed bin. The man hurried to Meg, and she saw that he wasn't a stranger after all. He had spoken to her at the roadblock. He was still wearing his sheepskin-lined jacket and snow-crusted toboggan cap.
"Are you all right, Mrs. Lassiter?"
"How many of them are there? I killed 4, and you killed 1, so how many are left?"
8 escaped."
"So just those 3 are left?"
"Yes." "Hey, your hand's bleeding. Are you sure you're—"
"I think maybe they've got a tunnel between the barn and the house," she said urgently, "and I've got a hunch the opening to it is around the bottom of that feed bin." She was speaking through clenched teeth and with a fury that surprised her. "They're foul, disgusting, and I want to finish them, all of them, make them pay for taking my home from me, for threatening Tommy. But how can we get at them if they're down there in the ground?" He pointed to a large truck that had just pulled into the driveway.
"We figured when we found the rats, we might have to go after them in a burrow, so among a lot of other things, we have the necessary equipment to pump gas down in their holes."
"I want them dead," she said, frightened by the purity of the anger in her own voice. Men were pouring out of the back of the big truck, coming toward the barn. Snow and wind-borne ashes from the collapsing house slanted through their flashlight beams.
"We'll need the gas,"
the man in the toboggan cap shouted. One of the other men answered him. Shaking with anger and with the fear to which she had not dared give herself until now, Meg went outside to find her son. 17. She and Tommy and Doofus shared the warmth and safety of the truck cab, while the men from Bilomec attempted to eradicate the last of the vermin. The boy huddled against her, trembling even after the warm air from the heater had surely chased the chill from his bones. Doofus was blessed with the greater emotional resilience that arose from being a member of a playful and less intelligent species that lacked a dark imagination, so eventually he slept. Though they did not think that the rats would follow the tunnel back to the ruined house, some of the Bilomec security men established a cordon around that still burning structure, prepared to kill any creature that appeared from out of the conflagration. Likewise, a cordon was thrown up around the barn to prevent any escape from that building. Several times Ben Parnell came to the truck. Meg put down the window, and he stood on the short running board to report on their progress. Wearing respirators to protect themselves, they pumped a lethal gas into the mouth of the rat's tunnel, which had indeed been located by the feed bin.
"We gave 'em a generous dose," Parnell said during one visit. "Enough to saturate a burrow 10 times larger than any they've had time to dig. Now we've got to excavate the tunnel until we find the bodies. Shouldn't be too difficult. They won't have gone deep while boring out a passage between the house and the barn, because going deep would have been wasted effort. So we'll start stripping the surface off the ground, the top few inches, digging backwards from the barn wall, across the yard, shearing the top off the tunnel, you see, until we turn them up."
"And if you don't turn them up?" she asked.
"We will. I'm sure we will."
Meg wanted to hate all these men, and she especially wanted to hate Parnell because he was in charge of the search, and, therefore, the only authority figure on whom she could vent her anger. But speaking harshly to him and maintaining her rage in the face of his obvious concern for her and Tommy was difficult, because she realized that these were not the men responsible for the creation of the rats or for letting them escape. This was just the cleanup crew, ordinary citizens, just like all the ordinary citizens who, down through all the centuries, had been called in to clean up when the big shots screwed up. It was the ordinary citizen who always made the world safe for peace by fighting the current war to the bitter end. Always the ordinary citizen whose taxes and labors and sacrifices paved the way for those advancements of civilization for which the politicians stole the credit. Furthermore, she was touched by the genuine sympathy and understanding that Parnell showed when he learned that her husband had died and that she and Tommy were alone. He spoke of loss and loneliness and longing, as if he had known his share of them.
"I heard of this woman once," he said rather enigmatically, leaning in the open truck window, "who lost her only daughter to cancer, and she was so crushed by grief that she had to change her entire life, move on to totally new horizons. She couldn't bear to look at her own husband anymore, even though he loved her, because they shared the experience of their daughter, you see, and every time she looked at him, well, she saw her little daughter again, and was reminded again of the girl's suffering. See, that shared experience, that shared tragedy, was like a trap their relationship just couldn't escape. So, divorce, a new city, new state. That was the only solution for her, drastic as it was. But you seem to have handled grief better than that, Mrs. Lassiter. I know how hard it must have been for you these past couple years, but maybe you can take some heart in the fact that, for certain people who don't have your strength, life can be harder."
At 10 minutes past 11 that night, 2/3 of the way across the yard from the barn to the ruined house, they scraped off another couple of feet from the top of the tunnel and found the 3 dead rats. They put the bodies side by side on the barn floor, next to the other 5 that had been shot. Then Parnell came to the truck.
I thought maybe you'd want to see them. That we've got all 8 of them, I mean.
I would, she said. Yes, I'll feel safer. Meg and Tommy got out of the truck.
Yeah, the boy said. I want to see them. They thought they trapped us, but it was the other way around.
He looked at Meg.
As long as we've got each other, we can get out of any scrape, huh?
Bet on it, she said. Parnell scooped up the weary boy in his arms to carry him to the barn. As the raw wind nipped at Meg, she jammed her hands into her coat pockets. She was relieved. At least for the moment, not all of the burden was hers. Looking over his shoulder, Tommy said, "You and me, Mom." "Bet on it," she repeated, and she smiled. She felt as if the door to a cage, of which she'd been only dimly aware, had opened now, giving them access to a new freedom.
Snatcher. Billy Neeks had a flexible philosophy regarding property rights. He believed in the proletarian ideal of shared wealth, as long as the wealth belonged to someone else. On the other hand, if the property belonged to him, Billy was prepared to defend it to the death. This was a simple, workable philosophy for a thief, which Billy was. Billy Neeks' occupation was reflected in his grooming. He looked slippery. His thick black hair was slicked back with enough scented oil to fill a crankcase. His coarse skin was perpetually pinwhit, as if he suffered continuously from malaria. He moved cat-quick on well-lubricated joints, and his hands had the buttery grace of a magician's hands. His eyes resembled twin pools of Texas crude, wet and black and deep, and utterly untouched by any human warmth or feeling. If the route to hell were an inclined ramp requiring a hideous grease to facilitate descent, Billy Neeks would be the devil's choice to pass eternity in the application of that noxious, oleaginous substance. In action, Billy could bump into an unsuspecting woman, separate her from her purse, and be 10 yards away and moving fast by the time she realized that she'd been victimized. Single-strap purses, double-strap purses, clutch purses, purses carried over the shoulder, purses carried in the hand, all meant easy money to Billy Neeks. Whether his target was cautious or careless was of no consequence. Virtually no precautions could foil him. That Wednesday in April, pretending to be drunk, he jostled a well-dressed elderly woman on Broad Street, just past Bartram's department store. As she recoiled in disgust from that oily contact, Billy slipped her purse off her shoulder, down her arm, and into the plastic shopping bag that he carried. He reeled away from her and took 6 or 8 steps in an exaggerated stagger before she realized that the collision had not been as accidental as it seemed. Even as the victim shrieked, "Police!" Billy had begun to run, and by the time she added, "Help! Police! Help!" Billy was nearly out of earshot. He raced through a series of alleyways, dodged around garbage cans and dumpsters, and leaped across the splayed legs of a sleeping wino. He sprinted across a parking lot and fled into another alley. Blocks from Bartram's, Billy slowed to a walk. He was breathing only slightly harder than usual. Grinning. Stepping out of the alley onto 46th Street, he spotted a young mother carrying a baby, a shopping bag, and a purse. She looked so defenseless that Billy couldn't resist the opportunity, so he flicked open his switchblade and, in a wink, cut the thin straps on her bag, a stylish blue leather number. Then he dashed off again across the street where drivers braked sharply and blew their horns at him, into another network of alleyways, all familiar to him. As he ran, he giggled. His giggle was neither shrill nor engaging, but more like the sound of ointment squirting from a tube. When he slid on spilled garbage, orange peels, rotting lettuce, mounds of molding and soggy bread. He was not tripped up or even slowed down. The disgusting muck seemed to facilitate his flight, and he came out of the slide moving faster than he had gone into it. He slowed to a normal pace when he reached Prospect Boulevard. The switchblade was in his pocket again. Both stolen purses were concealed in the plastic shopping bag. He projected what he believed to be an air of nonchalance, and although his calculated expression of innocence was actually a dismal failure, it was the best that he could do. He strolled to his car, which he had parked at a meter along Prospect. The Pontiac, unwashed for at least 2 years, left oil drippings wherever it went, just as a wolf in the wilds marked its territory with dribbles of urine. Billy put the stolen purses in the trunk of the car and, whistling happily, drove away from that part of the city toward yet untouched prowling grounds in other neighborhoods. Of the several reasons for his success as a purse snatcher, mobility was perhaps the most important. Many snatchers were kids seeking a few fast bucks, young hoods without wheels. Billy Neeks was 25, no kid, and possessed reliable transportation. He usually robbed 2 or 3 women in one neighborhood and then quickly moved on to another territory where no one was looking for him and where more business waited to be done. To him, this was not small-time thievery committed either by impulse or out of desperation. Instead, Billy saw it as a business, and he was a businessman, and like other businessmen, he planned his work carefully, weighed the risks and benefits of any opportunity, and acted only as a result of careful, responsible analysis. Other snatchers, amateurs and punks, every one of them, paused on the street or in an alley to hastily search purses for valuables, risking arrest because of their inadvisable delays, at the very least, creating a host of additional witnesses to their crimes. Billy, on the other hand, stashed the stolen purses in the trunk of his car to be retrieved later for more leisurely inspection in the privacy of his home. He prided himself on his methodicalness and caution. That cloudy and humid Wednesday in late April, he crossed and recrossed the city, visiting 3 widely separated districts and snatching 6 purses in addition to those that he had taken from the elderly woman outside Bartram's and from the young mother on 46th Street. The last of the 8 also came from an old woman. At first he thought that it was going to be an easy hit, and then he thought that it was going to get messy, and finally it just turned out to be weird. When Billy spotted her, she was coming out of a butcher shop on West End Avenue, clutching a package of meat to her breast. She was old. Her brittle white hair stirred in the spring breeze, and Billy had the curious notion that he could hear those dry locks rustling against one another. Her crumpled parchment face, her slumped shoulders, her pale withered hands, and her shuffling step combined to convey the impression not only of extreme age, but of frailty and vulnerability, which drew Billy Neeks as if he were an iron filing and she a magnet. Her purse was big, almost a satchel, and the weight of it, in addition to the package of meat, seemed to bother her, because she was shrugging the straps farther up on her shoulder and wincing in pain, as if suffering from a flare-up of arthritis. Although it was spring, she was dressed in black. Black shoes, black stockings, black skirt, dark gray blouse, even a heavy black cardigan sweater unsuited to the mild day. Billy looked up and down the street, saw no one else nearby, and quickly made his move. He did his trunk trick, staggering, jostling the old biddy. But as he pulled the purse down her arm, she dropped the package of meat, seized the bag with both hands, and for a moment they were locked in an unexpectedly fierce struggle. Ancient as she was, she possessed surprising strength. He tugged at the purse, wrenched and twisted it, desperately attempted to rock her backward off her feet, but she stood her ground and held on with the tenacity of a deeply rooted tree, resisting a storm wind. He said, "Give it up, you stupid old bitch, or I'll bust your face." And then a strange thing happened. She changed before Billy's eyes. She no longer appeared frail, but steely. No longer weak, but darkly energized. Her bony, arthritic hands suddenly looked like the dangerous talons of a powerful bird of prey. That singular face, pale yet jaundiced, nearly fleshless, all wrinkles and sharp pointy lines, was still ancient, but it no longer seemed quite human to Billy Meeks. And her eyes. God! Her eyes! At first glance, Billy saw only the watery, myopic gaze of a doddering crone. But abruptly, they were eyes of tremendous power. Eyes of fire and ice, simultaneously boiling his blood and freezing his heart. Eyes that saw into him and through him, not the eyes of a helpless old granny, but those of a murderous beast that had the desire and ability to devour him alive. He gasped in fear, and he almost let go of the purse, almost ran. In a blink, however, she was transformed into a defenseless old woman again. Abruptly, she capitulated. Like pop beads, the swollen knuckles of her twisted hands seemed to come apart, and her finger joints went slack. She lost her grip, releasing the purse with a small cry of despair. Emitting a menacing snarl that served not only to frighten the old woman, but also to chase away Billy's own irrational terror, he shoved her backward into a curbside trash container, and he bolted past her with the satchel-sized purse under his arm. He glanced back after several steps, half expecting to see that she had fully assumed the form of a great dark bird of prey, flying at him, eyes aflame, teeth bared, talon hands spread and hooked to tear him to bits. But she was clutching at the trash container to keep her balance, as age-broken and helpless as she had been when he had first seen her. The only odd thing, she was looking after him with a smile. No mistaking it. A wide, stained-tooth smile. Almost a lunatic grin. Senile old fool, Billy thought. Has to be senile if she finds anything funny about having her purse snatched. He could not imagine why he had ever been afraid of her. He ran, dodging from one alleyway to another, down side streets, across a sun-splashed parking lot, along a shadowy service passage between two tenements, and onto a street far removed from the scene of his latest theft. At a stroll, he returned to his parked car and put the old woman's black purse in the trunk, with the others taken elsewhere in the city. At last, a hard day's work behind him, he drove home, looking forward to counting his take, having a few icy beers, and watching some TV. Once, stopped at a red traffic light, Billy thought he heard something moving in the car trunk. A few hollow thumps, a brief but curious scraping. When he cocked his head and listened closer, however, he heard nothing more, and he decided that the noise had only been the pile of stolen purses shifting under their own weight. Billy Meeks lived in a ramshackle four-room bungalow between a vacant lot and a transmission shop, 2 blocks from the river. The place had belonged to his mother, and it had been clean and in good repair when she had lived there. 2 years ago, Billy had convinced her to transfer ownership to him, for tax reasons, then had shipped her off to a nursing home to be tended at the expense of the state. He supposed she was still there. He didn't know for sure because he never visited. That evening in April, Billy arranged the 8 purses side by side in 2 rows on the kitchen table and stared at them for a while in sweet anticipation of the treasure hunt to come. He popped the tab on a Budweiser. He tore open a bag of Doritos. He pulled up a chair, sat down, and sighed contentedly. Finally, he opened the purse that he had taken off the woman outside Bartram's and began to calculate his earnings. She had looked well-to-do, and the contents of her wallet did not disappoint Billy Neeks. $409 in folding money, plus another $3.10 in change. She also carried a stack of credit cards, which Billy would be able to fence through Jake Barcelli, the pawn shop owner, who would also give him a few bucks for whatever other worthwhile loot he found in the purses. In the first bag, those miscellaneous fencible items included a gold-plated Tiffany pen, a matching gold-plated Tiffany compact and lipstick tube, and a fine, though not extraordinarily expensive, opal ring. The young mother's purse contained only $11.42, nothing else of value. Billy had expected as much, but this meager profit did not diminish the thrill he got from going through the contents of the bag. He regarded snatching as a business, yes, and thought of himself as a good businessman, but he also took considerable pleasure simply from examining and touching his victim's possessions. The violation of a woman's personal property was a violation of her, too. And when his quick hands explored the young mother's purse, it was almost as if he were exploring her body. Sometimes Billy took unfencible items, cheap compacts, inexpensive tubes of lipstick eyeglasses, and put them on the floor and stomped them, because crushing them beneath his heel was curiously almost like crushing the woman herself. Easy money made his work worthwhile, but he was equally motivated by the tremendous sense of power that he got from the job. It stimulated him. It really did. Stimulated and satisfied.